What we'll learn now is how to properly classify a material, the number of class hazards associated with hazardous materials, and the degree of danger some of these hazardous materials may represent. Classification will help us answer the question of whether a material meets the definition of a hazardous material or it doesn't. And if it does, what class hazard do we assign it to? In relationship to being assigned a class hazard, some hazardous materials may also be assigned to what are called packing groups. Packing groups will indicate the degree of danger that the material represents. There are 9 numbered class hazards of hazardous materials. In addition, some of these class hazards are further divided into divisions. For example, Class 2 is assigned to gases, and gases are divided into 3 divisions. Division 2.1, which are assigned to flammable gases, Division 2.2, which are assigned to non-flammable gases, and Division 2.3, which are assigned to toxic gases. Now let's start from the beginning. Class 1 hazardous materials are assigned to explosives, and the classification criteria for explosives can be found in 173.50 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations. Now, explosives are a real tricky hazard to classify because typically the government, the U.S. Department of Transportation, or the Bureau of Explosives will be responsible for classifying and approving the correct package for a shipment of explosives. Division 1.1 are those materials that have a mass explosive hazard. These materials are typically going to be restricted for transport. Division 1.2 are those materials that have a projection hazard, but not a mass explosive hazard. Again, these materials will also be very restricted for transport. Division 1.3, these materials have a fire hazard and either a minor blast hazard or a minor projection hazard. And again, 1.3 materials will be a very restrictive explosive for transport. Division 1.4 materials have a minor explosive hazard, and these materials are sometimes commonly shipped in the transportation chain, some that you may be able to identify with fireworks and ammunition. Division 1.5 materials are insensitive explosives, and these materials will typically be restricted for transport unless approved by the U.S. government. Division 1.6 explosives cover extremely insensitive articles, and these materials will typically be restricted for transport. In addition to being assigned to a division number, Class 1 materials can also be assigned to one of 13 compatibility groups. These compatibility groups will help a shipper understand what controls need to be placed for shipments of explosives. For example, where they need to be segregated or stowed during transportation. Class 2. The definitions, classification, and packing group assignment for Class 2 materials will be found in 173.115 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations. Division 2.1 is assigned to flammable gases. And as a trainer, you'll want to connect with your audience by relating some substances and materials that may meet the definition of a Division 2.1 material. Flammable gases could cover materials such as propane, acetylene, ethylene, and so anyone in the welding industry might be able to connect with a shipment of acetylene in the transportation chain. Division 2.2 is assigned to non-flammable gases, and contrary to popular belief, non-flammable gases present multiple hazards. First of all, there's a pressure hazard involved in non-flammable gases. Another could be an asphyxiant hazard related to these materials. And again, connecting with your students for training is important. So you'll want to relate examples of non-flammable gases. And so do some homework and train only those items that you're comfortable with training. Division 2.3 is assigned to toxic gases. Now, toxic gases are typically a very restricted material for transport because of the inherent danger of the material being able to kill someone during transportation. Just imagine a toxic gas being confined to an enclosed space and then having a shipper or a warehouse person open up that confined space only to be met by gases that are toxic to them. So again, communicating the hazard, the defining criteria, and how one would determine whether or not that material met the definition of a toxic material is extremely important. Class 3 is assigned to flammable liquids. Now, this is one of the most common hazardous materials shipped in the transportation chain. And these materials include liquids, mixtures of liquids, or liquids containing solids in a solution or in suspension which give off a flammable vapor at not more than 60 degrees Celsius closed cup test. Now, some of the materials related to flammable liquids are going to be very easy to identify. They could be items such as paint, gasoline, kerosene, turpentine, polyester resins, and these things are probably going to be easy to identify with in the classroom with your students. Now, one of the harder things to communicate with your students is probably going to be the packing group assignments for these materials. Flammable liquids can be assigned to packing group 1, 2, or 3, depending on the degree of danger that material represents. Packing group 1 materials represent a high degree of danger, packing group 2, a medium degree of danger, and a packing group 3, a minor degree of danger. In the classroom, this could be easily communicated to the class by posing a simple question such as, "Class, would you agree that some flammable liquids are more flammable than others?" And that would be a good way to describe the packing group assignments assigned to flammable liquids. The classification and packing group assignment for Class 3 materials are pretty straightforward and can be found in 173.120 of the Code of Federal Regulations. The chart in 173.121 in the Hazardous Materials Regulations is pretty easy to read, and so you'll want to present some type of slide for the students to review when communicating this material. As far as packing groups are concerned for flammable liquids, when we're looking at the chart in 173.121 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations, the regulations outline the requirements for packing group assignments. For example, packing group 1 Class 3 materials will meet the definition of a flammable liquid that will have a boiling point of equal to or less than 35 degrees Celsius. Packing group 2 assignment for flammable liquids will be those materials that have a flash point of less than 23 degrees Celsius and a boiling point of greater than 35 degrees Celsius. Now for packing group 3 materials, these materials will have a flash point of equal to or greater than 23 degrees Celsius or a flash point equal to or less than 60 degrees Celsius, and of course the boiling point will have to be above that 35 degrees Celsius threshold. The classification criteria for Class 4 materials will be found in 173.124 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations. Class 4 is divided into 3 divisions. Division 4.1 is assigned to flammable solids. Division 4.2 is assigned to spontaneously combustible materials, and Division 4.3 is assigned to dangerous when wet materials. Now again, it's going to be important as an instructor to relate to the classroom those materials that could meet the definition of each of these divisions. So, either have an example ready, or be able to poll the class before they come in and ask, does anyone in the class ship any one of these divisions? Because if they don't ship it, then it's probably not going to be applicable to them in their workspace. And our goal is to train those individuals in their job functions. And this might be as simple as presenting each of the labels representative to each of these divisions in the classroom, so therefore the student can go back to their workplace, and if they ever come across a Division 4.1, 4.2, or 4.3 material, they can easily identify it. Class 5 is assigned to oxidizing substances and organic peroxides. Division 5.1 is assigned to oxidizing substances. Division 5.2 is assigned to organic peroxides. Now again, these aren't very commonly shipped in the transportation chain, so you'll have to poll your classroom to see before you go in to train whether or not your students actually ship these materials, because the classification criteria for these materials can be very technical in nature. For training purposes, you'll be able to direct your students to 173.127 for the classification of Division 5.1 materials and 173.128 for the classification criteria for Division 5.2 materials. Class 6 is assigned to toxic materials and infectious substances. Division 6.1 is assigned to toxic materials. Now let's take a look in the regulations and see what the regulations have to say about toxic materials. In 173.132 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations, the regulations read, "For the purposes of this subchapter, poisonous material means a material other than a gas which is known to be so toxic to humans as to afford a hazard to health during transportation, or which, in the absence of adequate data on human toxicity, is presumed to be so toxic to humans because it falls within any one of the following categories when tested on laboratory animals." Now here's where it gets tricky. There are 3 criteria in which a toxic material can be tested. One would be oral toxicity, secondly would be dermal toxicity, and third would be inhalation toxicity. Now, oral toxicity would mean how much do I have to eat before it makes me sick or it kills me. Dermal would mean how much do I have to get on my skin before it gets me sick or kills me. And inhalation would be how much do I have to breathe in as far as mists or dust are concerned before it gets me real sick or it kills me. So again, these are tested on laboratory animals and not on humans, and that's a good thing. And you can always kind of bring light to that in the classroom as an instructor. Division 6.2 materials are assigned to infectious substances. Let's take a look in the hazardous materials regulations at section 173.134 and see what the regulations have to say about classifying a Division 6.2 materials. Now, those shippers that ship Division 6.2 materials are probably going to be those shippers that ship only these types of materials and nothing else. So this may be a very specialized training program for those trainers that are involved in training for Division 6.2. So in the regulations in 173.134, the regulations state that a Division 6.2 infectious substance means a material known or reasonably expected to contain a pathogen. Now, Division 6.2 materials are easy to identify because they are assigned to one of four UN numbers, and those are UN 2814, UN 2900, UN 3373, or UN 3291 as applicable. In addition, Division 6.2 materials are assigned to one of two categories, Category A and Category B. Now, today, Category A materials are making a real big run in the media with the outbreak of Ebola. So we see an increase in training in that arena today with all of the news and hype going behind Ebola. But let's take a look at what a Category A infectious substance is. A Category A infectious substance, for the sake of these regulations, are infectious substances in a form capable of causing permanent disability or life-threatening or fatal disease in otherwise healthy humans or animals when exposure to it occurs. Now, Category B infectious substances are those infectious substances that are not in a form generally capable of causing permanent disability or life-threatening or fatal disease in otherwise healthy humans or animals when exposure to it occurs. Now, professional medical judgment will come into play when trying to classify these materials. If you're not a doctor or scientist, you're probably not going to be the ones classifying, or your students won't be classifying these materials for shipping. Class 7 is assigned to radioactive materials. Radioactive materials, like explosives and infectious substances, are a very specialized category of hazardous materials that will be trained often on their own outside of any other types of training involved with shipping hazardous materials. For trainers responsible for training in radioactive materials, the classification criteria for radioactive materials is going to be found in 173.403 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations. Now again, it's going to be important for you to communicate in class labels that are representative to radioactive materials in the classroom, so be sure to have at least images of those on standby for a PowerPoint presentation, or even better if you're able to show a real live label in training class. Class 8 is assigned to corrosive materials, and the classification criteria for corrosive materials can be found in 173.136 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations, and in addition, packing group assignment for Class 8 materials can be found in 173.137 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations. In 173.136 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations, the regulations state that for the purposes of this subchapter, meaning the Hazardous Materials Regulations themselves, corrosive material, Class 8, means a liquid or solid that causes full destruction of human skin at the site of contact within a specified period of time. Let's take a look at some of these packing group assignments. Packing group 1 materials are those materials that cause full thickness destruction of intact skin tissue within an observation period of up to 60 minutes, starting after the exposure time of 3 minutes or less. Packing Group 2 materials, other than those meeting Packing Group 1 criteria, are those materials that cause full destruction of intact skin tissue within an observation period of up to 14 days, starting after an exposure time of more than 3 minutes, but not more than 60 minutes. Packing Group 3 materials are those materials other than those meeting the definition of a packing group 1 or 2 that cause full destruction of intact skin tissue within an observation period of up to 14 days, starting after an exposure time of more than 60 minutes, but not more than 4 hours. Now, in addition to intact skin tissue destruction, packing group 3 materials can also be classified based upon their destruction of certain metals. So let's take a look at those. They are those materials that do not cause full destruction of intact skin tissue, but exhibit a corrosion on either steel or aluminum surfaces exceeding 6.25 millimeters a year at a test temperature of 55 degrees Celsius. Our final numbered class hazard would be Class 9. Class 9 is assigned to miscellaneous hazardous materials. Miscellaneous hazardous materials are those materials defined as materials which present a hazard during transportation but do not meet the definition of other class hazards. For example, materials such as asbestos, carbon dioxide solid, environmentally hazardous substances, engines, all of these materials could meet the definition of a Class 9 material. Now, there is an additional class hazard that is not numbered called Other Regulated Material, ORMD. This material will be phased out by the year 2020, but it's one to be familiar with because many retail companies still ship under ORMD classification. The ORMD classification exception is found in 173.144 of the Hazardous Materials Regulations. So therefore, you'll want to cover it, but understand that most other regulated material classification criteria is going to be assigned to limited quantities after the year 2020. We've only scratched the surface for classification in this video lesson. There are many exceptions outlined in the Code of Federal Regulations that a shipper can take advantage of. Make sure that if you were training in these exceptions that you can easily communicate them to your class. Now let's go out into the warehouse and see how Andy's applying the classification criteria that we've learned here today. Andy, I see that you're taking the information from the safety data sheet and comparing it against the hazardous materials regulations. That's a great first start. Now if I was to ask you what a packing group was, how would you answer that question?
Well, that tells you what type of package to use, right?
Not exactly. The packing group indicates the degree of danger that the material represents.
So now that I found the information on the SDS, where would I find out how to package it in the 49 CFR?
Great question. When you were looking at the hazardous materials table earlier, there are 3 columns in column 8. Column 8A, 8B, and C. These columns indicate a paragraph reference for the material, and if you go there, it'll outline the authorized packaging that you can use for the material that you're shipping.
That makes sense.
As a hazardous materials trainer, you'll find that questions such as the one Andy asked come up quite frequently, and that's why it's important to emphasize proper training when it comes to hazardous materials.